Right, TJ Power, you're a neuroscientist. You look at things like cortisol, you look at stress, you look at these things. I tend to look at the relationship between stress, cortisol, and things like visceral fat, fat accumulation in general. But you were telling me earlier that cortisol is sometimes wrongly demonized, that cortisol may not be the real big thing we should focus on when it comes down to even stress and stress management and ultimately downstream of that, fat accumulation.
When I first came across this idea of how do we really reduce stress, of course, cortisol is the big topic that appears, but I was looking into how the different neurochemicals impact this, and it became very clear to me that the endorphins chemical played a really significant role in stress reduction and also our capacity to tolerate stress. I came across this incredible research by a scientist called Pelosi that showed that when we experience a significant rise in endorphins, our cortisol begins to diminish and our capacity to navigate a stressful experience rises. It's really interesting when you actually look at this because our area of research looks at this idea called the evolutionary mismatch. It's something that's popularized by a chap called Gluckman, which basically looks at these neurochemicals evolved for 300,000 years to help us thrive as hunter-gatherers, and we're living in a very vastly different way to that now. If you were to look at the hunter-gatherer experience of life, when we experienced extreme stress, it was basically based on two key scenarios. One was we were super stressed out because we didn't have the capacity to find food and find resources to survive. The other would be that we were in extreme physical danger. Those are the two key sources of stress. Very different to all the different arrays of stress that we now have in our modern world. Whenever we couldn't find food or we had danger in our physical environment, some kind of threat to our survival, there was only one thing that followed, and that was physical activity. Our body immediately had to go into extreme physical exertion. Extreme physical exertion is exactly what boosts endorphins. If we create a rise in this chemical, it was helping us tolerate the stress of hunger and capacity to survive. And I think people are underestimating that when we're stressed, endorphins is the real answer.
Interesting. Now, endorphins don't just rise from extreme or intense activity, right? Like you can get a peak in endorphins even from relatively low intensity.
Yeah, any time in which the body is entering some kind of physical exertion, endorphins will begin to increase. And that's one of the reasons the sedentary lifestyle that we have today is so terrible for our capacity to tolerate the stress that's coming our way. Our body really wants physical exertion. From the moment it begins to move, its capacity to increase endorphins rises. There's even a brilliant scientist called Estavo who's looked at stretching and endorphins, and even basic, simple stretching will create a rise in this chemical.
I put a link down below for 30% off through Thrive Market. You know what I like about Thrive Market, and I'm going to be very real with you, is that just because something is allowed on a grocery store shelf or something is allowed in a food product because it's generally recognized as safe, doesn't mean that it's good for us. Just because there haven't been studies that show that it really harms people doesn't mean that there isn't evidence that it might not be really good for us. And most of us, 99% of us, don't have the ability to go into a grocery store and know how something really affects our body, right? The thing I like about Thrive Market is that the foods that are on their shelves, digitally speaking, are good quality foods, and they have people that put their best foot forward to really find good quality food that's sustainable, that doesn't have hidden nasty ingredients, and is now accessible and a lot of times more affordable than most grocery stores. So that's what I respect about them. Whether you want snack foods, whether you want something that's more wholesome, whether you want something that you want to use in a meal or spices or a treat, they have it all. So that link is for 30% off your entire first grocery order and a free $60 gift. It gets delivered right to your doorstep. The quality of the food is awesome, and they're out there for a really, truly good cause, which is why I'm a fan of them and why I've supported them for all these years. So that link is down below.
The reason I asked that question is because when people are stressed and they do have a rise in cortisol, there's this common sort of misunderstanding that the stress of exercise would only add to that cortisol and would be problematic. And that isn't entirely incorrect, but it's also has merit, right? Like when you're extremely stressed out, your allosteric load, so to speak, is high from your relationship stress or stress in general. Like, yeah, you may not want to go do a balls to the wall workout. Like that might not be the best time. Maybe your risk of injury, maybe also like, yeah, you will pile on more cortisol on top of that. But I think you don't want to do the opposite. You don't want to just like I'm stressed, so today I'm going to do nothing. Just getting out and getting moving can still have enough of an endorphin effect to blunt the cortisol.
Definitely. And there's also more than just the key idea of moving, but the base idea you're sharing there is you don't want to get super stressed and then go and kill yourself in the gym, because you put yourself at risk there in that situation. But the big thing is currently in our modern world, often our main coping strategy for stress is what we call quick dopamine. Anytime which you've had a really stressful day at work, it might be tonight I'm going to sit on the sofa, watch Netflix whilst watching social media with a glass of wine in my hand. That's a very dopaminergic experience to distract ourselves from the stress. Really, anytime we're experiencing stress, we should have this awakening in our mind of, okay, my brain is going to need endorphins in order to navigate this experience, and getting moving is the way I'm going to find endorphins increasing within my brain and body. And if the scenario is I just need to get out walking, that would be a great solution. If it was stretching, if it was a light workout in the gym, it's going to give you the opportunity to separate from the thing that's stressing you out. Maybe it's a work scenario, maybe it's something in a relationship, whatever it may be. Separate from it, experience an increase in physical exertion, create a rise in endorphins, and then when you come home, you want to do some of the things that would lower cortisol, some of the breathing-based activities or an early night or whatever it may be that settles the body. But our body evolved to experience physical exertion first and then settle itself down.
This is super, super cool because this conversation is just coming at an awesome time where, like, recently we've been talking a lot about visceral fat. We've had some of the leading experts in visceral fat accumulation come on the channel recently, and all we've been talking about is like how there are more cortisol receptors in our visceral fat. And I'm making a point here, but the visceral fat essentially is hyper responsive to cortisol and stress, meaning when we are in a stressed out state, the propensity to gain visceral fat is much higher. And visceral fat, in case people don't know, that's very metabolically active fat that is extremely inflammatory, very dangerous, and linked correlatively with just about any chronic illness and cardiovascular disease and coronary artery disease. Point is that when you effectively do things like add sugar on top of having a rise in cortisol to try to cope with the cortisol, when you have this presence of cortisol and high amounts of calories or sugar or even insulin to a certain degree, the sort of, let's just call it coexistence of those two things at one time can lead to more accumulation of that visceral fat. And it kind of comes back to the same discussion of, okay, well, perhaps the best way to modulate that cortisol is to actually, I'm going to go out on a limb, and this is somewhat scientifically incorrect to say this, but use that cortisol to your advantage, because cortisol in a calorie deprived state, although still stressful, is actually going to help you lose more fat, lose more visceral fat. And it's not to say that the person that's, stressed out and losing weight because they're stressed out is losing weight in a good, healthy fashion. But that does occur, right? When people are hyper stressed and they can't really eat and they start to lose weight. I'm talking about gamifying that. You're stressed out. A lot of times the last thing you want to do is go do some form of a workout. But you could actually capitalize on some of those catecholamines and the cortisol, like actually get a positive benefit out of it, both in the short term from potentially a fat loss side of things, but also long term, of course, by having the endorphins that solve the root issue of getting the stress down in the first place.
Definitely. And I think we can underestimate the importance of the fact cortisol is rising in our body largely because it's experiencing the effect that action is about to be required. We didn't have back in the day just like cortisol that led to us just worrying in our mind and staying sedentary. Cortisol was driving action effectively. You see a strong relationship between cortisol and adrenaline also increasing, creating more energetic movement within our body. You see dopamine rising to make us motivated. And if we're experiencing a stressful moment, it's very important to know that just exercise is something that needs to be involved first. It doesn't mean that you don't need to really prioritize relaxing as well, but it's just that exercise in that moment could be harnessed in order to effectively utilize some of that cortisol that is coming into our brain and body. The other thing to know is it's not just exercise and stretching that will increase endorphins. You have alternative options as well. Hot environments have become very popular, whether that's in simply having a bath or in a jacuzzi. You create this experience called the heat stress response. And then if you push that to the extreme end of saunas and steam rooms, there's this brilliant scientist called Henderson that shows that we experience an increase in endorphins when we're in hot environments. Very simply put, any time in which our body was put into physical pain or difficulty, endorphins would rise. Previously, that was typically extreme physical exertion of running or fighting. When you're in a hot environment like a sauna, you will also notice around 10 minutes in, like this is getting quite hard physically. In that moment, your body doesn't know that you're not going to be in there for hours. And it's effectively in that environment thinking, wow, I need to prepare myself for physical pain that's coming. Endorphins will then release, and that's going to create a de-stressing effect on your brain. So whether it's exercise or stretching, you've also got heat that will play a role.
So I've heard in the past that endorphins aren't necessarily what's responsible for like the runner's high quite as much. And it's like a myriad of other things. From what you've seen, like what do endorphins feel like? Does it give us a physical like sense of well-being, or is that more a rise in serotonin that occurs later on, and the endorphins are just having like almost a systemic like underlying effect on our stress, or is that wrong? Do endorphins actually help us feel something, and can we get addicted to the feeling of endorphins, or is it really something else that we get addicted to with like a runner's high?
Endorphins most predominantly evolved simply with pain and stress management. So it's actually more that they're creating a relief from pain. That's the bit that's pleasurable. And the best word that you'd associate with endorphins is euphoria. Just like a really light feeling of like presence, and there's just not like lots of pain and stress tying you down effectively. So it's not like this really like positive mood. It's almost a relief from tension. And a lot of us are carrying a huge amount of tension in our lives with our work and our jobs and relationships and kids and whatever it might be. And the experience of endorphins releasing, maybe that runner's high or something from an exercise type scenario, is like this blissful, I'm not in that like tense, stressful experience right now. And yeah, in itself, that could become something that became quite addictive, because it's like I really like being in that free feeling with a lack of stress within my mind. But it's really important that emotion evolved so importantly to help us survive extremely stressful scenarios. Like if you was actually running away from an animal, you couldn't be running away thinking, oh my God, I'm going to die. Oh my God, I'm going to die. You needed this chemical that could rapidly produce within your brain that put you into a blissful state of, I have the capacity to survive the situation, and stress alleviated from the brain in order to make you focused on the task at hand, surviving.
You know, where I feel that, like in such a literal example of that, is, do you ever do any like breath work or anything like that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you're at a hold on empty or something, and you're holding for 2 minutes, and you just want to breathe so bad, and then you get that first fresh breath of life, and you're like, that is when you're still and you're doing that. It's almost like that's endorphins. Like you just got through, like you just satisfied this pain, and all of a sudden you've got this immense like surge of probably a million other things too, but there's definitely an endorphin response, and that part can be addicting because you just like that short-term feeling of like, yes, I got through this pain, this is pleasurable.
Definitely, it's that feeling of relief. It's nice as a human that's holding lots of tension, and you see a strong relationship between breath work and endorphins. Again, it's that whole correlation of extreme physical exertion of the body. If the heart starts racing and you're taking big inhalations and exhalations, your body is perceiving like, wow, something is changing in my physical environment. And whilst we're now modern humans that will just wake up and do that on the couch instead of like having a bear chasing us, your body's thinking, okay, there is something going on in my environment and I need to prepare this endorphin chemical. And you can get really euphoric, really amazing experience with breath work. Like I've had sometimes, even in college, I had this breath work specialist working with me, and I did it on Zoom, and these were like 60-minute sessions where I did like extreme breath work and breath holds, and it's wild what it can do to your mind. It can provide a really relaxing, like health promoting experience within you.
I think there's pretty big surges in BDNF as well that come like when you do breath work, and there's neuroplastic changes that can actually occur. Like your brain quite literally becomes more malleable. To be able to. Is there any evidence between, say, exercise, not necessarily just endorphins, but exercise and some of these other things we're talking about, and the brain becoming more plastic? And let's take this time to kind of talk about what neuroplasticity is just a little bit too.
Yeah, so neuroplasticity is the idea of the brain just adapting and changing and rewiring over time. It's an extremely advantageous component of our brain. For a lot of the original neuroscience history, we really believed that by the age of 25, the brain was quite stationary and it remained the same for the rest of our life. It became extremely apparent as neuroplasticity became understood that our brain is constantly adapting to the environment we're in, which of course makes sense. You do see a relationship between exercise and BDNF. BDNF being a key factor, a key neurochemical that's going to lead to our brain being more plastic, more malleable effectively. And if we are engaging with lots of healthy actions whilst we're having more endorphins, whilst we're having more exercise, whilst we're having more BDNF, our capacity for our brain to shift and evolve over time towards that healthier outcome is going to be enhanced.
That would make sense. And it's like, what are some other ways that people can sort of change their brain a little bit? I mean, for rewiring, so to speak.
It's very interesting because I think one of the big lanes with rewiring the brain is largely actually the communication that's taking place within the brain. We touched on this within the oxytocin conversation that we had. There's this brilliant scientist called Colanello that really looks into when you're communicating with yourself in your mind, there can be neuroplastic changes along with oxytocin increases. And it's really important to understand that if you're seeking for more positive health outcomes within your life, the way in which you're communicating with yourself about the benefits of them, deeply understanding the benefits of them, is going to create a shift in your brain's malleability and its outcomes. And that's why conversations like this, like spending time, as I have and I'm sure you have, listening to people in this space and learning really deeply the education that can benefit you and why things are benefiting you is going to be really valuable to you.
When you also, like in the same vein of neuroplasticity and whatnot, you mentioned something earlier about cortisol and adrenaline being closely tied together. Did they almost always increase somewhat parallel? Do they almost always kind of have that same relationship where when cortisol goes up, adrenaline goes up? Or are there ever circumstances where cortisol goes up and adrenaline doesn't go up?
You want to think largely as adrenaline and dopamine being the most interconnected. You want to think of those two as like cousins within our brain. So if you were in a scenario where danger was occurring, dopamine would make you hyper focused on that scenario in order to have your attention lasered on it. And adrenaline would create this really rapid rise in energy effectively in order to help us survive. Cortisol in many situations where there was a lot of stress involved as well would also increase. I think in the modern world, what we're experiencing is rather than, as you say, cortisol and adrenaline rising together as a result of something being stressful in our physical environment and requiring energy to survive, requiring physical action. Now we can have cortisol rise as a result of, oh, look at my bank balance, it's different to what I was expecting it to be. I spent too much money, and suddenly like stress in your brain about financial situation. But then you're not accompanying that with adrenaline that's going to be utilized with physical action. When you have physical action, you utilize the adrenaline that's within your body. When you just have adrenaline rising as a result of stress, but you stay sedentary, you're not utilizing it, and it's going to sit within your body for longer, causing your heart rate to increase and so on, and stress you out more.
And this may be a little off topic from originally talking about endorphins, but I do want to spend a minute to talk about serotonin for just a second. Just because I feel like in the mainstream, people really get confused between dopamine and serotonin. I think they really like, if anyone's ever taken, 5-HTP or something before, like you feel sort of like you might feel on, and I've never taken an SSRI, so I don't know what that would feel like, but you probably feel like that. Like the 5-HTP, if I take 100 or 200 milligrams of 5-HTP, I don't really want to do much of anything. I'm very content. Like I'm very if I take 200 milligrams of 5-HTP at night, I might sleep well, I might be calm and feel like the world is fine, but I really don't have that drive. Like I lose some of that drive. And it became very clear at that point when I realized what, serotonin is not exactly, serotonin is more like, you're okay. But can you kind of explain what serotonin is, just so that maybe a 5-year-old would understand it, just really basic?
Definitely. You really want to think that dopamine and serotonin are vastly different chemicals. They, of course, have an interplay and they have a communication with one another. But dopamine is this one simply motivating us to take action on challenging activities. That's what dopamine is here to do. Serotonin is vastly different. Appleton, a brilliant scientist in this serotonin space, showed and revealed this idea that 90% of this serotonin chemical is being generated in our body, within our gut. We've got a very clever system called our vagus nerve, which is allowing that serotonin system within the body to communicate with the brain. And effectively, this chemical evolved to make sure our body was in a state of peace and happiness and thriving. So any action like nutritious food coming into our body, being well rested, napping, calm, slow breathing patterns, being in natural environments, getting good sunlight exposure, anything that was leading to our body being in a state of satisfaction and contentment, allowing it to thrive, increase serotonin. So serotonin is nothing to do with, am I doing something challenging? It's actually, is my body in a happy, content, and peaceful state? If it is in that state, serotonin can rise, and we're going to feel this sense of calm come over us rather than the dopamine, I'm really motivated to do hard things.
That's a great explanation of it. So what are some ways that we can influence serotonin? Are these able to be gamified a little bit? I mean, obviously, I think breath work, just like downregulation in general, but what are some ways that we might be able to, I think it's just a good discussion to have along with the endorphin discussion, because endorphins are like immediate action, but then serotonin, like getting a stranglehold on that might be a little bit better for long-term stress management.
Definitely. If I was to tell you the ultimate kind of serotonin day from the moment you wake, you would wake up, you'd make sure you got some good morning sunlight exposure. Brilliant scientist called Lambert looks into this rise in serotonin that comes from sunlight exposure. You would then be thinking from a nutritional standpoint, what am I going to be consuming this morning, or maybe at midday if you're in the intermittent fasting world, that's very nutrient dense. Anytime strong nutrient dense food enters our body literally is sitting there going, wow, look at all these nutrients. I can generate serotonin out of that. We have this brilliant precursor to serotonin called tryptophan. It utilizes those nutrients from the food to build the serotonin. So you've woken up, you've got good sunlight exposure, you've thought about what is a nutrient dense meal that I'm going to have. Then you've got the world of breathing patterns. There's this amazing world by this scientist called Hilaire, which basically shows really nice, slow, calm breathing patterns that activate our vagus nerve, are going to increase serotonin. There's this brilliant idea of resonance breathing, where you try and slow your breathing down to 6 full breaths per minute. So that would mean breathing in for 4 seconds and out for 6 seconds. That would be a 10-second chunk. And you do that a number of times. So you do that 6 times would be a minute. You've taken 6 full breaths. So I'd be thinking very much down the lane of sunlight exposure. I'd be thinking about nutrient-dense meal, and I'd be thinking about calm breathing patterns. That start to your day is going to create a great elevation in serotonin. It doesn't mean you're going to be in a state of inaction, because you'll be doing good dopaminergic stuff, but you're going to be more calmly motivated rather than stressed out motivated as your working day begins.
That's a beautiful explanation of it. I feel like in today's society, we don't necessarily give ourselves a chance to really, we think that some of the activities that are serotonergic, is that the right?
Yeah, serotonergic.
So that the things that we would do would be promoting that sort of action. But it's actually just the opposite in a lot of cases. I feel like people think, like doom scrolling or something is going to, this is how I relax. So like, no. It feels relaxing because you're tricking your body by giving it little hits of what it wants. You're giving it little drugs, so it's easy to misconstrue that. Be like, no, I'm relaxing. Well, no, you're just getting high.
True relaxation is lying out in nature on some grass with bare feet with some like other people that you love. That would be true relaxation for your body, where your body deeply settled. If you were in that environment, you were in a natural setting, you were with some humans that you felt connected with, you were eating some natural foods, connecting with nature in the sunlight, maybe you can even lie there and close your eyes for a bit and nap for a second. That is what would put our brain into a deeply restorative serotonergic state. Being on our phone feels relaxing because it's giving us what I believe is called false presence. Effectively, it's really stimulating our prefrontal cortex, taking us away from the thinking side of our brain and making us think, I feel really good now because I'm not thinking about anything. Alcohol has the exact same effect. So you feel super stressed out, drink a glass of red wine, oh my God, now I've got no problems. Immediately as the dopamine rises and the prefrontal cortex activates. But then you just get a rebound effect where the thoughts are going to rush back into your head. If you enter that deeply natural serotonergic state from nature and natural being as a human, which is what our brain is craving so much in our very modernized world, that's what really restores the system and leaves you just each day feeling much calmer and happier.
I think the common theme that's popping in my head when you're talking about this is like serotonin is safety oriented. You feel safe, right? You feel safe because you don't have an immediate threat, or safe because you're with those that you love. Like you feel safety, right? Like it's, and that's at least how it feels for me. It's like when there's not a lot of stress in my life and I actually can just lay down and like stare at the sun or watch the clouds, like that is a feeling of like, I wouldn't do that if I didn't feel like I'm in a safe frame of mind, or like safe with those that I love. Like, okay, my family's here, my kids are safe. Like there's a sense of safety. And it's funny because again, that same, Visceral Fat doctor, Dr. Romero, he was talking about, and this is funny, it's come up a couple times in recent interviews. It's funny how the world works, but talking about how, if you look at a deer or a gazelle or something, when they're in, they go from immediate stress, there's no in between, and then it's like back to grazing on grass, not a care in the world, right? It's like their ability to throttle that. And I feel like that's sort of what we have lost in our world today. Like it's really hard. I mean, just given the situations that we have, right? Like we have constant influx of information, constant influx of validation and criticism, both of which are probably too much. So how on earth could, it's really difficult to be able to just say that I can just sit here and enjoy eating, maybe not grass, but this burrito or something, right?
For sure. And I think also in that scenario with the deer, it's thinking about the very significant difference between acute stress and chronic stress. Like the deer is experiencing like a rapid, oh my God, I'm in danger. And then now I'm not in danger. And then rapid, I'm in danger. Now I'm not in danger. Whereas a lot of us are experiencing chronic stress where we're feeling stressed out all the time, which is really challenging for these brain chemicals. The other thing I'd also like to add with the idea of could you get yourself into nature and like settle yourself down into that environment? Because we're so dopamine addicted now, it actually is very uncomfortable. Like if you lay down on the grass in some sun, whilst it might sound peaceful, you lay down, it's like boom, problems are coming into your thoughts, and it's like I want my phone to distract me and all that kind of stuff. We've created this framework called the boredom barrier, where we've basically seen that when you initially go into a state of quiet and you go into a state of slowing down, it's actually very uncomfortable because of the lack of stimulation you're experiencing. And our brains are becoming very familiar with, I'm always hyperstimulated. Then when we come out of it, our brain's like, nope, I don't want to be here. So it stresses you out to try and guide you back to the action it was originally in. What we basically see is after about 14 to 15 minutes of boredom, the brain releases and it begins to settle. That serotonin begins to rise because you're in that nice, peaceful environment. But I would make sure you start breaking this boredom barrier. So you allow yourself to be in an environment like that where you're simply doing nothing. Could be eating some food, could be having conversation. It's great to have some time in the quiet and nature. But if you allow yourself to break that boredom barrier, you'll find that there's this really peaceful area of your mind that you're not unlocking as a result of the constant pursuit for stimulation and distraction.
So the boredom piece, we can kind of make this brief, but you hear people talk about the default mode network. Is the default mode network shutting down or activating more when we're bored? It's activating more, right?
Yeah, it initially activates more. And that's why a lot of the ruminative thinking can suddenly begin, because the prefrontal cortex is reducing activation because we no longer have something stimulating our environment. And then the default mode network turns on. So a lot of that kind of ruminative, worrisome thoughts begins to occur. But as it begins to occur, we always jump back to prefrontal cortex and go back to stimulation. But if you allow some of that thought process to be had, like, yeah, I've got to think about that thing with my work, and I've got to think about that relationship idea, and these different aspects of your life that may be worries for you. Once those thoughts have been had, your brain can settle into a deeper part of the default mode network where it just becomes quite chilled out and relaxed. But often we feel uncomfortable with that ruminative aspect, so we just jump back in. It's really important to allow that aspect of our brain to activate. We spent huge amount of time, our ancestors spent huge amounts of time with their default mode network activating, where they're just wandering along, doing very little. And we need those periods in this modern world even more than ever.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's almost like we don't get enough of that default mode network activated, so then it feels wildly uncomfortable when we are there. And then when we do relax, we never get a chance to actually get out of the default mode network because we never give it a chance to go there in the first place.
Yeah.
So when it does go there, it has a lot to do, right?
It does. Yeah. And it's really important to understand so many of the answers to your problems are lying in that quiet time. And often nowadays in the modern world, we have problems coming into our mind, like I feel stressed about this or worried about that, whatever it may be. And we think, yet I don't want to talk about that, so let's just opt for distraction. If you allow yourself to actually experience those thoughts and hear those messages and hear the emotions that are coming your way, they have their moment to be heard and they dissipate and they leave. But if you live a life of constant distraction, those door knocks are only going to get louder and louder in your life. The more time you give yourself to effectively process that experience, the more peaceful your mind becomes.
And you can never get into those actual thoughts that you need to do, that you need to have to really work on yourself. If your default mode network is always, you're never getting a chance to get into that deeper state or sort of past the default mode network.
It needs a while. We recommend when we're training people with Dose that they have, at the beginning, we do 20 minutes headphone free in nature, and people feel a bit uncomfortable about that. Like, what am I going to think about? Again, around 15 minutes, you find the mind calms. We move people to eventually people are doing like 90-minute walks in nature without the headphones, without any stimulation. And they think that sounds like hell. And they come home and realize it's actually heaven for our mind to have that peace. It's just something we've become unfamiliar with in our world today.
Amen to that, man. Well, TJ, where can everyone find you?
If you go to @TJPower on Instagram, if you look at my book, we've got a book called The Dose Effect that comes out in January, and thedoselab.com if you want to begin your dose journey.
Rock on, brother. Thank you.
Let's go.